and welcome to the latest Retire Well episode with me, Matthew. As always, I'm joined by Joe, and today we're going to think about what you should think about when you're consolidating pensions. We've talked already on the pod about different types of pensions and looked under the bonnet of them. Today we're going to specifically work through a checklist of the various things you should think about with your pensions when you're thinking about consolidation. So we know that Joe loves a stat, so let's kick off with Joe and a stat about pensions.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was looking at this, I thought I'd look at the main issues when we're looking at pensions. So it's estimated that around 1 in 5 people have actually lost a pension pot during their lifetime, which is obviously a good portion of the population. There's probably an estimated 3.3 million lost pots in the UK with an estimated value of around £31 billion. And obviously, if you break it down person by person, it might be 5,000 here, 10,000 there, but it can a lot of the time build up to sort of a larger amount in retirement, and could be the difference between you retiring this year or next year. So as Matthew said, we're going to look at A, how do we find those pots? B, once we've found them and know where they are, what should we do to pull them together? What things should we be thinking around pulling them together? So Matthew, do you want to start off, I suppose, about sort of who should be looking at consolidating a pension and maybe when you should look at it?
Definitely, and I think from that point there, who's potentially lost a pension, I was recently talking to a client who is already retired, he's already put his pensions together and he's got a long-term plan that works, and he happened to be talking to a mate as he was walking the dog, and his mate said, I tripped over a pension pot the other day and there was more money there than I was expecting. And he said, well, hang on, we've worked at the same place all our lives, moved jobs a couple of times. I know I've got this pension and that pension which I've tidied up, but where's the other ones gone? For him, we managed to track down a pension, and it was actually a defined benefit pension. So there was a guaranteed income for life there and some tax-free cash. So again, we have real examples where people have tripped up and found this money, tripped up on this money. So again, it's a brilliant way of just saying who should be looking. Essentially, anyone who has retired or anyone who's still working and is looking to tidy up their pensions, they should almost have a quick list of where you've worked and have those pensions been accounted for. And if you've got an employer where you say, I can't remember if I paid into a pension scheme there or what happened with it, that's a logical thing just to almost look through a payslip and think about those pots of money. There is a website, pension tracing service, where people who don't know who their provider was can almost say, if I look up this previous private employer, they can then go through that and say, okay, here are the sort of companies that you might need to write to get some information. So I think that's definitely a good starting point.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd definitely say the main sort of trigger to look at consolidating a pension pot is leaving employment, especially as we're no longer necessarily in the times where you would have one employer from age 18 all the way to retirement, and people do tend to jump around jobs a little bit more. So I suppose a checklist of that when you are moving employer is, where's my old scheme? Once you've got your new scheme, do you want to move it into your current employer scheme or something else that we might move to there?
Yeah.
And then also, Matthew, you mentioned sort of that retirement is another good time that if you haven't previously looked at consolidating, it could be much more simple in retirement to have the simplicity of one pot that you can draw down on for various reasons that I'm sure we'll touch on today.
Yeah. And it makes sense at this point to answer the common question that we'll get is there a central place that I can just check my national insurance number and they'll tell me all my pensions? Again, this has been coming, it's been pushed back. The idea of a central pension dashboard makes complete sense, and multiple pension ministers have said, I will make this happen. So far, no one has actually introduced it. It's pushed back and pushed back. It will come at some point because there's complete sense and there are dates in the diary. I think it's just people, old pension schemes currently having to go through archives and dig up very much paper files to then put them onto a system that can then work for everyone. So at some point, yes, in answer to those questions, there will be a dashboard where you can just go on and it'll tell you what all your pensions are and you can't possibly lose any. But until then, it's very much important to think about where yours are and to keep regular track of them.
Yeah, I think with regards to that pension dashboard, I was reading a little bit prior to the podcast. Yes, it has been pushed back. Now there do seem to be a few more solid dates in the diary for actually getting the providers to enrol. And it seems to be the case where there'll be almost a central dashboard, almost with the government, that'll be rolled out first.
Yeah.
And then with individual providers potentially look at rolling out their own, which again, might come with its own difficulties. But yeah, we'll keep up to date with that, and if it ever does come up, I'm sure we'll mention it. So I suppose in terms of steps, we've almost covered that first step of what do we do when we're looking at consolidating pensions. First of all, it's finding out where they are. Next thing you need to do is sort of actually look at what's within the pension and what benefits and potential disadvantages are. So the easiest way to get up to date valuations is if it's got an online dashboard. Find out your a dashboard obviously different to the consolidated dashboard that we spoke about there that will contain all your pensions, but it might be sort of an individual provider dashboard where you can log in, look at your investments, look at your values. As Matthew said there is the sort of pension tracing service or the government website where you can log in, look at your employers that you've previously had and the potential pensions that you've got there. But equally, if you know the scheme, even if it's a private pension, you can go on there, find the relevant number. As long as you've got your national insurance number with you, a lot of the time you'll be able to call up with them and they'll be able to give you an actual up-to-date valuation.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth remembering with the different types of pensions, again, defined benefit pensions versus defined contribution pensions, you might almost be asking for different things. So it might not always be that you're asking for a value, you might be asking for a projection of benefits. So again, you just essentially have to find out, does a provider have a record for yourself? And then if you ask them to provide a full retirement pack, that's either going to be a value and the defined contribution pot, or it's going to be the defined benefit pension of how much annual pension you would get, and if there's an option to transfer away, like that cash equivalent transfer value that we talked about from the defined benefit pension. So jumping into consolidation, why might people have more than one pension in retirement?
Yeah, I mean, as you've said there previously, is a lot of the time it comes from a new employer where you've moved employers, you've had your contributions go into that employer, then you've moved, you've got a new one, and people tend to just forget about it. I'd say that's the main reason. Another reason why you might have looked at contributing to a personal pension in the past. I come across that quite a lot where someone maybe opened it at age 18, probably pretty good advice to have, and it's now become a bit of a larger pot and they just want to know what to do with it.
Yeah, and I think when you get to retirement, the simplest way I describe it is a pension is an employer in retirement. So do you want to have 2 employers, 3 employers, 4 employers if you've got 4 pensions? Certain times the answer will be yes, and that tends to be if a pension's got some sort of safeguarded benefits or something valuable that you don't want to give up by consolidating. So that moves us on nicely to think about if you have information about your various pensions and you're almost comparing them. You know, we've talked about the idea of an MOT. I think that analogy works with this, where you might have multiple cars, multiple pensions. You're looking under the bonnet, looking at the individual features and saying, is there anything valuable here that I want to keep a hold of, or am I happy to combine it all and I'm just going to have that one family car? So really you're looking at, is there anything like guaranteed growth rate that's going to be better than the market? Is there a guaranteed annuity rate, which is going to give you a guaranteed income that's better than the open market? And is there any sort of safeguarded benefits that I would potentially lose by moving away? Thankfully, with pensions that have special features like this, there is some sort of guarantee that stops you accidentally transferring it away, and that is essentially any pension that's worth more than £30,000 with safeguarded benefits, you have to have formal advice from a pension transfer specialist. So that's someone like ourselves, someone like myself, who can, review it and say it's in your best interest to move, or tell you why it's not, and that's why you should have those multiple employers.
Yeah, absolutely. It may feel like we've almost jumped ahead there to look at sort of safeguarded benefits, because they are probably one of the more complex things about pensions, but I think it's good that Matthew's brought it up at the start there, because if anything like that, like a guaranteed annuity rate, protected tax-free cash, protected pension age even, with the pension age going up, does come up in your statements, I'd always say that's a time where you just go, maybe this isn't the sort of thing that I can do myself. Let's speak to an advisor, find out exactly what these guarantees are, how valuable are they to me, do I need them? Because sometimes you might not need them, and even though you do have those benefits, it might make sense to transfer. But I'd say that's just a real sort of flag to just say, let's go speak to someone, find out exactly what I need to know, and then after you've sort of got that, then you can almost if you don't have those valuable benefits, maybe look at it yourself a little bit more and look at sort of what might I be able to do in terms of the more sort of basic bits with regards to a pension.
Yeah, definitely. And I think even with those more basic bits, I think that can be quite intimidating and quite scary for people. So it could be a point that if you look at something and you're not comfortable, that's when formal advice adds a lot of value. But certainly from every year as you go through reviewing your pensions, you could be saying, if I've got multiple pensions, I want to compare performance, charges, and that's really our next steps for those bits.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we were sort of preparing for this podcast, what I tried to do is speak to our paraplanning team, which is the technical team that very much do all of this in the back end. If you're going to look and speak to an advisor about consolidating, and essentially just look at what do we look at when we're looking at consolidating a pension. I think the first thing that we generally look at is looking at the asset allocation of the of the pension, because that lets us know a few different things. Because as we spoke about in previous episodes, one of the key things that we look through with clients is their attitude to risk. So how comfortable are they with the ups and downs of the stock market? And if the asset allocation is a bit out of kilter, if they're taking more risk in their pension than they're comfortable with, or potentially even taking less risk and they could actually afford to take more risk, that's one thing immediately where we could look to potentially change that, be it within the pension itself or look at it when we're consolidating. Matthew, do you just want to run through a little bit more detail with regards to that?
I think it's an interesting one because you might think of yourself as a middle-of-the-road investor, but you might have had 4 or 5 different pensions and their automatic setups might have been, one ends up being low risk, one ends up being high risk, one's in the middle, and again, you've had no common investment strategy. So I think straight away, pension consolidation can add value from that point of view. But it's also worth thinking about lifestyling. Again, this is one of Joe's bugbears, where you get an element of automatic changes to risk where someone might not understand it, they might not have really opted into it, and they might then get stung by the negative consequences. One that always sits in my head is the impact from Liz Truss. I had some clients retiring at that point where they consider themselves really low risk individuals, and therefore when their pension scheme said, don't worry, when you reach retirement age, you're in a low risk approach, they thought, perfect, that matches me. What they didn't realise was that low risk approach then meant they were heavily invested in gilts, which was massively impacted by Liz Truss's and Kwasi Kwarteng's mini budget and the massive change that had to gilt yields. So really, the capital value of their pension maybe swung by 20% when they were being told it's a low risk investment. So I think that's when we have to think, how much risk can someone tolerate? What's their capacity for loss? And then look at the various bonnets, the various pensions to say, do they all align, or are we suggesting tweaks to one or the other to get them into that middle bit?
Yeah, and I think what sort of almost comes hand in hand with asset allocation is the performance of your existing investments, because by definition, sort of however much equities you hold in it, depending on your risk profile, will drive what performance you have. Yeah. So I think performance is good to look at in 2 different ways. Every single investment that you have will compare itself to a benchmark, what it's trying to beat over time. Yeah. And you should be able to access them through your pensions to see what that benchmark is. Is it overperforming? Is it underperforming? One thing to say, though, is that the funds often select their own benchmark, so it might not necessarily be reflective of sort of similar pensions in different ways. The other thing that you can compare it to, I suppose, is your other pensions, see how they've performed. I mean, in an ideal world, you want the pension to have as low a risk as possible while maintaining sort of a good performance. So that's something that we often look at with clients when we're bringing a number of different pensions together. We look at how volatile that pension has been, how many ups and downs has it had over the last 5 years, and what return has it had, and the less volatile you can get it and the more performance you can get it is essentially where you want to be.
Yeah, definitely, and it all comes back to that individual's view on risk, because we speak to some people who are really risk averse and we speak to some people who are really keen to invest for the long term. So you can have someone who says, actually, that's perfect for me, and someone who says, oh no, that scares me. So again, the benchmark is perfect for comparing one fund or a number of funds to their peers, but actually sometimes it's that spectrum and that absolute comparison to say, are you happy with this? And if you compare number of pensions, if one's done really well and one's done really badly, again, that's prompting you to think, what level of risk are they taking, and is it just that one of them's an expensive fund or one of them's poorly managed? again, that's the bit where at least you know with an active review what's under the bonnet.
Yeah, and I think if something has underperformed, your next steps would then to be look at what alternatives do you have within that current pension, because it might be the case that you do have a lifestyle strategy, like Matthew said, which isn't sort of aligned with your current long-term investment strategy of going into drawdown. So then you might want to look at how many other funds are available, because some modern pensions will have thousands, almost tens of thousands of investments available, and then some older, particularly if you're looking at employer schemes, there may only be sort of 9 or 10 different investment alternatives.
Yeah, which is where you're comparing your Peugeot to your Lamborghini in the sense of your investment options.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the next thing we'd look at, and then I suppose after that you'd start to look at in turn with the performance at the costs of investment. So there's a few different costs that you can look at within a pension. Matthew, do you just want to sort of run through what they might be?
Yeah, definitely. I think again with charges, lots of people come at it from the point of view of you want to automatically choose the cheapest. Again, I've heard people say you wouldn't choose the cheapest parachute. So again, I think it's about value. But really, when you're looking at a pension, you're thinking, what's the cost of the underlying funds? What's the cost of the actual platform? And then is there any advice cost built into the pension? Again, are you having any personalised advice, whether that's from a pension provider or specifically from an advisor like ourselves? Those are the 3 layers of charging, and you should be looking at them, side by side to compare them. You can have older policies, which are things like with profits funds. Again, there's a bit of jargon in there, but essentially that's where there's a bit more of an opaque charging structure, and it's a case of almost understanding where the charges come from because they're built into the performance. But yeah, essentially you want to make sure you're not overpaying, because any overpayment there for charges wise is something that could have been in your pension growing, but equally sometimes the cheapest doesn't have the wide range of options, and therefore it's a balance. People who are in auto enrollment schemes, which is the automatic saving into pensions that the government have made mandatory now, they might be in a nest pension or a smart pension or some of the very common names there. When we look at the nest pension, again, there's an extra cost on contributions. I think that's about 1.8%. And actually that ends up being quite expensive compared to other pensions, but people just assume it's competitive because someone else has set it up for you and it's been mandated. So it's really just understanding your own charges at that point.
Yeah, I mean, generally, if you're looking at your pensions, generally a sort of employer pension will usually have pretty low charges, and they usually sort of, I suppose, because they're such large schemes, they can provide them at a lower cost, which when you're contributing to them, it isn't necessarily a bad thing to have lower costs, because then you don't have to perform quite as well to get the same level of performance. As Matthew said, though, with stuff like Nest that have a 1.8% contribution charge, if you've sort of changed employer but almost continued to contribute into the Nest scheme, taking 1.8% of every single contribution you can put in will really add up over time. So that's one thing that we tend to look at there.
One of the things you mentioned there about an employer scheme being quite cheap, I think that's often the case, but sometimes they're not really thinking about your retirement options. So again, they could be really cheap and good for accumulating funds, but it then might lack the flexibility that you want in actually accessing the pensions. So, that's jumping on to the options you have available, but it's definitely something when you think about performance charges, retirement options, you can't just look at one of them and say on its own, yes, that's fine. You need ticks in a few of the boxes to say that's going to be a pension that works for me for the future.
Yeah, it's interesting to say that. Quite often, I'd say we come across times where the clients might have 2 or 3 different pensions and they're in the right place, they've performed pretty well, the costs are low, and they're maybe 10 years from retirement. That might be a time where we say, well, actually, you're doing all right there, they're doing the right thing. You don't necessarily need to move them just now. And then at retirement, because they don't have the correct drawdown options available, such as flexi access drawdown that Matthew spoke about there, then we'd probably look at moving them closer towards retirement, because then you can benefit from the lower charges while you're accumulating and you need simple needs, but then move them over and then get all the bells and whistles that you want in retirement.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. Again, other things you should look at when you're accessing and thinking about your pensions is whether you can consolidate them, because not all pension schemes allow transfers in. So again, you might say I've got 4 or 5 and you might say, well, I want them all in this one. They might say, okay, well, we don't accept transfers in. So you might say, if I am 10 years away from retirement, I'm happy maintaining 2 or 3. And then when I get on the cusp of retirement, that's when pulling them together into that one pot, that one employer in retirement could be a lot more powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose the last one of, the basics when you're looking at consolidating pensions is general service level and admin. It very much varies from provider to provider, and in the same vein of they might be fine when you're accumulating them, but when you're in retirement and you're looking at taking withdrawals, you may want someone that's just got that little bit extra touch that you can be in contact with if anything does go wrong and you need a withdrawal out.
Yeah, and I think that's where a large provider with good financial strength, good service, they are always going to do what you expect. We particularly get frustrated by defined benefit scheme administrators because some of the big names like Mercer and Capita just don't really care about the end person, and their service levels are very poor. And if you look at things like Trustpilot and the reviews, some of the companies like Mercer have actually rebranded because of how badly their service was and how badly their reviews were. So again, I think you almost want to look at that and say, is my pension in a reputable place? I'm happy with the level of service. And again, if you're not, financial advice can definitely add value there to say, well, actually, we've helped hundreds, if not thousands of people to retire. So therefore we can say, let's pull these together, and we've got the good experience of telling you who can help. Again, just one person making those decisions can be quite intimidating.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to sort of touch a little bit more on the different options that you could have within a retirement, a pension portfolio, and sort of which ones you might want? I know we've spoke about it previously with regards to sort of flex access drawdown being the best, I suppose, from a flexibility point of view.
Yeah, I think really this is where jargon comes in, and drawdown now, modern drawdown gives you the flexibility to take what you want when you want. You can also have a pension that supports an annuity, which we've talked about in a previous episode, which is that guaranteed income for life. If a pension doesn't have full drawdown, they can have UF+. UF+ is, again, jargon, but it's essentially accessing lump sums from your pension, and it's accessing them in the proportions of 75% taxable income and 25% tax-free cash. For pure simplicity, you can just think of UF+ as I'll take lots of lump sums, over time, but it's not quite as flexible as drawdown. So if your plan was to take an income and you think you might vary it in retirement, you would benefit from the full bells and whistles, as Joe said already, about drawdown. And again, you might ask your pension provider what their options are, and they might say you've got no retirement options, but we can switch you to another plan that we offer, which will allow you to do that. Again, you just want to be checking what's the charges like, and again, you can compare that with other providers who might then offer a better whole level and a whole service.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if it's okay, we'll just sort of quickly go back to the sort of safeguarded benefits side of things, just to, I suppose, explore each one individually, because a lot of the time I get clients that come to me that have got a pension with safeguarded benefits, and they really want to just take it all at once or move it and draw down. And I don't think most people anyway understand the value of some of the benefits that are available there.
Yeah.
So I suppose one of the main ones that you come across is a guaranteed annuity rate or a guaranteed minimum pension. Matthew, do you just want to run through what they are and the potential benefits of them, and maybe when you might want to look to change out of them?
Yeah, definitely. So a guaranteed annuity rate is essentially saying built into the contract, there is the rate that you can get at different ages to exchange that pot of money for an annuity. So exchanging that for a guaranteed income for life. What that's saying is, regardless of the fluctuations in annuity rate, regardless of what happens in the market, this is how much we're going to pay you. And when interest rates are low and annuity rates are low, that's a really good benefit to have. But you then have someone who comes along and says, I don't want an annuity, I want drawdown. And again, for that person, you need to work out what really offers you best value. We've had people who've come to us in the past and have been adamant that the guaranteed annuity rate doesn't add any value for them. But when we've actually done the analysis, that's been better to take the guaranteed annuity rate with that pension and then to potentially take less drawdown from another pot. So you want to weigh that up together. A guaranteed minimum pension is essentially saying that regardless of what a pot becomes, there's going to be an amount that an employer or a provider will give you in retirement, and that's a bit like a defined benefit pension. And we've also seen a lot of people who come and get in touch with us and say, I've got a defined benefit pension, it's going to give me £2,000 per annum, but there's a transfer value here of £40,000. I'd much rather have that, please. Again, that person is in the same position of having safeguarded benefits over £30,000, where they need formal financial advice from a FCA pension transfer specialist to say, we reviewed it and we see it's in your best interest to move. The problem that lots of people have there is to prove and show it's in your best interest. Again, you're working with variables like life expectancy. If someone lives to a normal life expectancy of, say, 85, 86, again, they're going to benefit from that annual income that could quite quickly be worth more than £40,000. But that individual might say at 55 or 60, well, I just want the flexibility now. So that's the things we have to weigh up. The FCA, our regulator, would say that the majority of people should think about accepting the scheme pension. But again, there is that weigh up of life expectancy and other things. Protected tax-free cash is another one that people often sort of say, well, actually, if I have to take it with this pension provider, do I really want the little bit of extra tax-free cash, but then I don't get the flexibility of drawdown? Do you want to touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think protected tax-free cash and also protected pension age are probably the lesser known safeguarded benefits. So where you might, with that pension provider, be entitled to slightly more tax-free cash. In some cases, it might be significantly more, but you almost just have to weigh up the opportunity of, do you want that large amount of tax-free cash but not have those flexible benefits? Or would you prefer that sort of flexible retirement that we spoke about so much throughout the podcast? With regards to the sort of protected pension age, this is something that I don't think many people know about at all. So previously when you might have had pensions that would have allowed you to take your benefits prior to age 55. Now, with the pension age moving up to 57 in 2028, if you had a pension prior to a certain date, it might be possible to protect your pension age 55. So if you're thinking about retiring before then, that could obviously be a real benefit. If not, then it might not be as much of an issue and you could look at consolidating the pension.
Yeah, definitely. I think you're right. It isn't that commonly known. People have heard about the minimum pension age of 55. Some people have heard that it's going up. It's going up in line with state pension. Again, it's going up with life expectancy, so it kind of makes sense. But it's that element of, if you had a contract that was already taken out and 55 was written in, that can still apply even when the rules change. Again, we've seen pension simplification in the past. This is another thing that just makes things a lot more complicated and a lot more things for people to think about. Technically, I've got a small pension from a previous employer where the pension age was 55 and it is protected. Again, that doesn't affect me because I'm going to be saving into other pensions where it is actually going to be from 57, but it just does help people to not accidentally consolidate pensions when they might have said, well, actually, there might be a benefit of accessing some funds in those few year windows. Protected tax-free cash, I find, is a funny one because often it comes with the strings of buying an annuity. So I've had someone where you could say, okay, due to quirks in pension rules, you've got protected tax-free cash of, say, 30%. And you go, oh, well, that sounds a lot better than the 25% I can have a standard. But then you say, okay, you're mandated to take an annuity at this point and you can't do anything else. At that point, the person might say, actually, I'm willing to give up that extra tax-free cash because I see my income needs being more in line with drawdown. So again, that's a very important advice area to weigh up what works best for you. Again, we've talked about the best of both approach, the Hovers approach, where you might have some guaranteed income and some flexible income. A guaranteed annuity rate or protected tax-free cash might get you one or the other. And that's what we're trying to work through with clients in a bit more sophisticated positions.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we've run through quite a lot there and appreciate it might be quite a lot to take in. But with regards to common trip-ups, we've obviously run through a few of them already. One of them that I'd maybe just mention is with regards to sort of current workplace pensions. If you're in the sort of the mood of consolidating and you've previously consolidated into one pension provider, you might want to almost bring in your current pension with your current workplace provider to that. Reasons being, you might have limited investments
choices, yeah.
or fund choices in your current employer pension, and you might want to move it to a more comprehensive fund choice in your consolidated pensions. But obviously there are a couple of issues with that. Some might not allow a partial transfer out, so instead of transferring the full...
What's a partial transfer?
I've jumped ahead. Yeah. Generally, you wouldn't want to transfer your full pension from an employer to a personal pension because you lose out on the employer matching. Some employer matches are pretty significant. Some will go sort of double what you're putting in, and there's not many investments that you can get 100% return on day one. What I mentioned there with regards to a partial transfer, some people might look at moving a portion of their investment out of their current employer pension, moving it into a personal pension to give them a bit more employer investment choice while still getting the employer contributions.
Yeah, I think, again, the simple answer is when you've got an active workplace pension and you and your employer are putting into the pension, do nothing tends to be the standard thing because you can then benefit from the growth. If someone's approaching retirement and they're getting ready to access pensions, they might consider a partial transfer, or we might recommend a partial transfer so they can be then ready to do other things such as using tax-free cash or starting income. But in general, keeping that and benefit from the matching makes sense. People not benefiting from the full employer matching is one of my bugbears because certainly, younger people aren't necessarily educated on the benefits of pensions and the fact that if an employer match, say, up to 5% and you're only putting 3% in, you're missing out on that extra pay rise essentially from your package. So, one of the things we would say is if you can afford to put more into a pension, definitely do it. But equally, make sure you're taking the maximum benefit of an employer who is matching your contributions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose a common question that we tend to get with regards to pensions is if you've got a few different pensions and maybe one or two of them are a little bit smaller, go, why do I need to consolidate? Why can't I just take them all at once? And I suppose you can, but you just, again, need to be careful, as we've reiterated in previous podcasts, with regards to how you take it. Because if you take it in the wrong way, you might limit future pension contributions. And that's where potential small pots and triviality comes into with regards to pensions, which is essentially just a simple way in that you can take pensions up to 10,000, 3 of them up to 30, so 3 times 10 is 30, doing a bit of quick maths on the podcast, that allows you to take those pensions in a way which doesn't restrict future contributions.
Yeah, I think the simplest way to think about it is don't dip into a pension or don't take a pension unless you have to, and if you have to, make sure you're not accidentally triggering something like the money purchase annual allowance, which might impact you going forward, reducing the amount that you can contribute into a pension. So that's where small pots doesn't trigger the money purchase annual allowance. So if you had to, you could access a few pots, as Joe says, as long as they're less than £10,000. But in general, pensions are there for the long term. So try not to use them unless you have to. And if you do have to, talk to a financial advisor just to make sure you're not accidentally triggering something and you've not put yourself in that bear trap where you're then going to potentially punish yourself for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as we've said, there are quite a lot of different things to consider when you're consolidating pensions or thinking about doing it. The easiest way to do it is sort of along the way. So each time you look to move an employer, assess your last one. Can it move in? Can it not?
People don't tend to do that, though. It is funny. You say it and I smile.
Yeah.
People come walk through the door at retirement with a file of 17 different pensions and then say, do you think I can afford to retire? And that's
I'm just trying to make our job a little bit easier, Matthew.
But yeah, no, I think in general, thinking about them, having them, looking at them, making sure you know where they are. If people change, again, pension providers can merge and other things can happen. So don't lose a pension. But equally, as Joe says, if you can tidy stuff up as you go, that can help. But the more we talk it through, the more I think there's things to consider. And it always prompts me to think, gosh, would you trust me to come and do your job without any training? And sometimes this feels like the same thing where people have said to me, yes, I understand that, but that's scary. And how do I know which investment to pick? And how do I know which provider to pick? And how do I know whether I should be taking drawdown or annuity? And with all of those questions, that's when, good financial advice from, an independent whole of market financial advisor can really, really help you in this area.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a pretty good spot to end on, to be honest, Matthew. Thanks very much for watching the podcast. As usual, we have new episodes every Tuesday, and look forward to seeing you then.